Welcome everyone to the first panel in Something Wicked Film Festival DocuFest 2022. I am here today with three great people. So if you want to introduce yourself and what film you are representing, I'll start with Mary.
Good morning. I am the producer, director of Dark Shadows and Beyond, the Jonathan Frid story, which I'm happy to say has 3 nominations.
And Mike?
Yes, hi, I'm Mike Lydon. My film is called Haunted Thrills, which is a documentary about pre-code horror comics from the 1950s. And it's currently in the film festival circuit. It's done amazingly well. I'm kind of shocked, really. I wasn't expecting it's a success, but so far it's been in 14 film festivals and it has won 6 awards for Best Short Documentary. So there you go. So far, so good.
And Will?
Hey, everybody. I work with Mary O'Leary. We worked for Jonathan Frid, the star of Dark Shadows, way back beginning in 1985. And I've helped Mary out with the documentary Dark Shadows and Beyond, the Jonathan Frid story. So we're very happy that you folks have acknowledged the film. Thank you.
No problem. Well, as we're talking today, we're talking about directing. So let's go ahead and start about it. So the thing with directing for documentaries is people a lot of times don't fully sometimes appreciate it when they compare it to normal nonfiction or fiction films of, everyone talks about the big directors there, but no one really registers a lot of the directors for documentaries. So my first kind of topic is, what was your guys' inspirations when you guys got into doing documentaries?
I'll start. I began actually as a producer in daytime television soap operas. And I never had done a documentary before this one. It was a pretty amazing experience. I basically was trying to define exactly what it was, because is what you just mentioned is it's kind of vague. Where does the line cross producer, director? I was doing both. I had a lot of time because I knew the subject very well. Jonathan Frid, as Will McKinley mentioned, I had met in 1985 and I had worked with him. We had a production company together called Clones Associates. It was a theatrical company, which is under that umbrella. He toured 3 one-man shows. He really, for that, was pretty much his own director. So knowing the subject really well, I focused on how to present who he was. I mean, that was sort of the idea of what was the story. I think the most important thing I've learned along this journey is know the story you want to tell. And that really helps you in the editing room when you're sitting next to the editor. Is this helping tell my story or is this taking me off on a tangent? So really it was constantly reminding myself what I wanted to tell about Jonathan. And it really was his great passion for the stage. But as a director, you're dealing with talent, interviewing people, and you need to give them a certain amount of freedom. Although you have your questions, they often take you in a different direction. And a key is listening to what they're saying so that you don't have to necessarily stick, oh, this was my next question. No, they've taken me to another place, and this could be really valuable. And so I really learned by listening to the talent and culling out what could also be used in the story I was trying to tell. But a lot of it was trial and error. I had terrific videographers. Every town because I've traveled to interview people. I was in Canada, New York City, Memphis, my own place of residence, Los Angeles, and working with different videographers, but all terrific and super helpful. That was also, as a director, I knew what I had shot already, certain angles, so it was really helpful to them to discuss with me, well, what do you have? What are we looking for? And they were just always terrific team players. But your director is definitely, it's very, very important to have videographers who are on the same page, and really they can help the director tremendously.
And Mike?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Can you guys hear me better now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Is the audio better? Okay. Okay. Cool. Because I can hear you guys better. Okay. Well, the whole project for Haunted Thrills started actually back when I was living in Peru. I was there for about 3 years. And during that time, I wanted to make a horror anthology film. Typically, I make fiction, horror film, science fiction, that kind of thing, very low budget. So I made that film in Peru, and the film was based upon 3 stories from pre-code horror comics, of which I have been obsessed with for years. So when I decided to make the companion film Haunted Thrills, which was the companion to Witch Tales, the horror anthology film, I concentrated primarily on non-EC comics because everybody knows about EC, Tales from the Crypt, all that stuff. There have been several really great documentaries made about that. So Haunted Thrills concentrates on the lesser known pre-code horror comics and science fiction comics. And for me, I was already like, I'm not calling myself an aficionado on the subject, but I am heavily into it. So I have original comics, I have reprints, I have books about them. And so for me, it was a natural thing to do a documentary because Bowring knew a lot about it. The next step, and the critical and trickiest step, was that I was absolutely convinced that I could get a hold of some of the original artists from the 1950s that were still living to interview them. And that's what I did. I mean, I contacted as many possible, artists as possible. Of course, the unfortunate thing is that most of them have passed away. The 3 artists that I did end up finding miraculously that were still alive, Everett Raymond Kinsler, Joe Sinnott, and Victor Carabata, were all in their 90s. When I interviewed them, they were all in their 90s. So, and one of them was actually still actively working at the age of 94, which totally was amazing. So I went there, and as far as interviewing them, I think it turned out very well. As a matter of fact, apart from the Haunted Thrills documentary, I have 37 minutes of raw archival footage up now on my YouTube and BitChute pages of just the interview with Everett Raymond Kinsler. And you guys, you may be interested in checking this out because Kinsler was not only a comic book artist, he did a lot of covers for Avon Books. He then went on to become one of the premier portrait artists for all of the U.S. presidents from the 1960s on up, major celebrities. He had his studio, which is where I went in New York City to interview him. And the guy, I think he's just one of the most amazing artists I have ever seen in my life. This guy is absolutely stunning. And the stuff that he did for the pre-code era, even though he was involved with it for only about 3 years, is absolutely fantastic. So for me, the trickiest thing, I think, was doing the interviews because I kept in mind that these guys are in their 90s. And yes, it's like I couldn't even imagine living that long, much less actually still working when I'm that old. But they kind of like, you've got to, the tricky thing is keeping people on the subject. So my thing was like trying to find out as much information from them about the pre-code era. Well, they've lived, they've got 50 years of other things that they've been doing. So it's kind of like you get an hour interview and you have about 10 minutes of usable footage, but that footage is fantastic. A lot of it is in the Haunted Thrills documentary, and as I said, I now have the raw footage, at least of Everett Raymond Kinsler online, for people to see, because his story is fascinating. It's just an incredible, it would make for a great documentary unto itself.
Awesome. So going more into that, because with documentaries, there's three main things about, as directors, you guys have to wiggle around with: talking about your subject, any archival footage, the interviews, and anything else you wanted to add to the into your documentary. So how is that, as directors, was the process of, okay, I want to get, because finding footage of your subject or finding pictures of your subject, depending on your subject, like Mike, you talked about, was kind of hard. And so now today, everything's documented, but back then, both your subject were things that were not as documented as much. So how was that deciding, okay, I would love to get this, but if not, then let's try to interview this person, but going all about that, deciding how much of your documentaries you want to be of interviews and other stuff showing off the subject?
I wanted to, following up about talking with interviewing people who are in their 90s, I definitely had a few of those as well. And one of the key things, the first person that I actually interviewed was actress Marion Ross, who's remembered for the TV series Happy Days. And I sat with her and I began to tell her what I was intending to ask her. And she stopped me and said, "No, don't tell me until we start recording, because I will get confused. When you ask me, I'll think I've already answered it." That was so helpful. They naturally, you can, the short-term memory. So that was terrific. And that helped me in many of the other interviews after that. But yes, as you're mentioning, there's a balance of interviews and then footage. In my case, I was very fortunate. I knew that there had been a production that Jonathan had done that was recorded. He had thought it was live, but turns out, no, it was on tape. It was from 1961. There was a series called The Play of the Week. It only was around for 2 years. The first season was 59-60, and then 60-61 was the second season. And he was in a production of Henry IV Part 1 on the stage in New York City. And what the Play of the Week was, they would take a play shortly after it had closed and restage it for the cameras. And it was amazing to see Jonathan on stage doing Shakespeare in his prime, because Dark Shadows was actually after. This was the early 60s. So I was fortunate through research. There's a lot with, of course, archival. You're really researching many different places, libraries. This was in a volume of Variety where I saw that was mentioned, and I tracked it to the UCLA archives. Then once you locate it, then it's the process of how do you get it, because mostly you need to get the transfer, and sometimes it won't hold up. So you keep your fingers crossed, and it turned out very, very well for this production that Jonathan was in. So that was wonderful to have that in the documentary. During the time I worked with him, he had a series of interviews because he was in the Broadway production of Arsenic and Old Lace. That's where he worked with Marion Ross, Gene Stapleton, Larry Storch, and Gary Sandy. They'd open on Broadway, and then they toured around the country for almost a year. So I had, during that period, he had done television interviews in many different cities on the tour. So I still fortunately had kept copies of that, but it was VHS, and didn't know how that would transfer. And some did well, others not so well. So basically I was fortunate that I kept that. And then also Dark Shadows fans, of which there are many, 30 Facebook pages to the show, or actors who are on the show. Reaching out to them, and some of them had recordings of going to see him, say, at a Dark Shadows fan convention, or other interviews that were on, say, their local station that they had recorded. So it was quite, reaching far and near to get footage, and then figuring out, all right, what's the story? And I wanted to have a balance. And in terms of, I always felt I couldn't just see one person. One cut of a person I interviewed. I always wanted to see them at least twice, potentially maybe more, but at least twice. I don't want to just introduce somebody once and never see them again. There's also, well, what's the timing of it? So in the beginning, I was talking about his family life, so that's where I saw family members. But then they come back later. Jonathan, in his career, he was from Canada, Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, and he came into New York City to pursue his career in the 50s, and then was in New York City for 40 years. But at later in life, he decided he wanted to go back to Canada. So he went back. And so I also tell that part of the story. And so I go back to his family, who we've been introduced to, and we see them back towards the end of the story. It's a give and take. It's really trying to find those moments, whether it's in an interview or that you did currently, or whether it's an interview from the past. And always, as I mentioned, it's figuring out the story and how does this tell the story of who he was. But I really, I had a tremendously fun time. I was rather nervous when I first started the interviews, but it really was fun because the actors would really interact. You know, you could see their passion. And after one interview with Christina Pickles, actually, so people remember her from St. Elsewhere, and she said, "You really made this enjoyable for me because I could see your passion for this project." So that was wonderful to hear that. So I think it's looking to see in the editing room. I mean, you're going to be spending many, many hours in the editing room and, falling in love with things. And then suddenly the editor says, "Do you really need that?" I had a terrific editor, Michael Giglio. The nice thing for me was he didn't know the TV series Dark Shadows. He didn't know who actor Jonathan Frid was. So he could have that objective eye, and was really helpful when we were getting down to, we need to cut some material, and really saying, what about this? And do you really think you need this? Or maybe we could trim this. So so much of it is taking all that footage and you start to tell your story. I mean, it's really quite an adventure.
Mike?
Oh, I'm sorry. Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Is this to a new question or?
No, it's the same question I asked Mary.
Oh, this is the same. Okay. Yeah. As far as my documentary, and I just wanted to mention you guys, Mary and Will. Amazing. I'm gonna have to look up your documentary. I'm a Dark Shadows fan. I'm watching it currently on Tubi.
Oh, great.
So,
great.
The whole series is on there. Jonathan Frid is just so great. He's just one of those
terrific
guys.
Yeah.
And I also want to catch that Arsenic and Old Lace. That just sounds fantastic. If there's any of that video that's still available.
There's a clip that I use in the documentary, but I only had clips. I didn't have. Unfortunately, I don't have the whole production.
Right. That would be something to see. That is fantastic. Getting back to doing my documentary on pre-code horror comics, I had the 3 artists who I interviewed, and that worked out very well. And I have to, this was all 2019, just towards the end, up until, I guess, December 2019, all of the interviews were conducted. Okay. All of those artists have since passed on. That is just, it's just, it's one of those things. I literally was one of the last people to interview all of them on the subject of pre-code comics. And the only other person that I interviewed was Vincent Zerzolo. Now, Vincent Zerzolo, he runs the Metropolis Collectibles shop in New York. This place is famous. You can go there, you can visit. He's got, I don't know, countless millions of dollars worth of comics. And I'm not just talking about pre-code comics. He's got like the Action Comics #1 on the wall, and he's got all of the original art, which is just another, aspect to the, considering the fact that most of these artists in the 1950s, when they did the art for these comic books, 95% of all of that art was destroyed. When those publishers went out of business after the Comics Code Authority came in 1955, and the pre-code era was gone, those companies went out of business. All of what they had was totally destroyed. And even if it wasn't, some of the companies would just routinely destroy that original art to make space for new stuff as it came in. So you had not only that aspect, but the fact that, of course, during the early 50s, there was such an outcry against these pre-code comic books, which ushered in the era of the Comics Code Authority, that there were people, much like the burning of the Beatles albums, remember in the 60s, there was this whole thing where they had a tirade against the Beatles and I guess maybe rock music in general. They were burning these comics by the millions. So now what you have are comics of which maybe 100 survive of one issue. You know, you've got maybe a dozen survived of this issue. Extraordinarily rare and sought after. So it's a situation where the idea of collecting is still as big as any other genre, any other aspect of collecting that you can think of. I have just witnessed, I mean, it's one thing to spend like, to kind of like, spend maybe $500 on a comic book. It's another thing to spend 500,000, and these people do it. It's just it's stunning to me to see the rabid collecting that goes on between the pre-code and then the post-code going into the Marvel like 1960s superhero era and stuff. It's just a big money racket. That's basically what it is. To me, my thing was that a lot of the artists from the 50s were unfortunately, because of the Comics Code, when that kicked in, those companies folded. A lot of those artists went back to their day jobs, to whatever they were doing before, painting houses or, whatever. A lot of artists just lost their livelihoods. That's what happened. And some of these artists were fantastic. They were really quite talented. So my focus was putting a spotlight on these artists and these publishers that made the lesser known comics. That was the big thing for me. And being a pre-code enthusiast, it was easy for me. It was like the natural progression from doing a feature film using some of those original stories to doing a companion piece, which is a documentary about the film. So I went to New York twice, actually, once to interview Everett Raymond Kinsler, the artist, and then again to interview Vincent Zerzolo at Metropolis. And a lot of that footage is in the documentary too. It's just to hear some of the amazing stories from Vincent Zerzolo about, his it's another level of collecting that I can't even comprehend. For me, it's just like paying $100 for some pre-code comic is incredible. For those guys, paying $500,000 is not unheard of for a comic book. So, it was, in the stories, of course, he's got access to the people, other collectors, artists, and so forth that you could only dream about. So fortunately, I was able to learn a lot through him about some of the other artists and some of the, especially the stories behind their, working for different publishers and the original art that was somehow salvaged, of which he has, I would say, at least hundreds, maybe thousands of pieces of the actual original artwork from the 1950s, from the pre-code era. So that a bit of that is in the documentary as well. Keep in mind, Haunted Thrills is only 25 minutes. It was only meant as a companion piece to the feature film, to kind of say, hey, look, this is where I got the stories from, and these are the artists that made it happen. That was kind of my idea, spotlight on the artists, the lesser known comics of that era, and some of the publishers and what they did. So that was it. That was that. And of course, one of the top things was to show as much of the art, the cover art and original art in the documentary as possible. And that's what a lot of people have said, you know, in commenting to me about the film. It's like, man, I have never seen like 90% of the things you showed. I've never even seen them before, you know? So it's like the discover something new, you know, get people hooked on, you know, things that they'd never heard of. Because when people talk about pre-code comics, it's always EC. It's always like, oh yeah, well, I know Tales from the Crypt. And that is just one of hundreds of publishers that existed during that era. So the idea is to bring the lesser known stuff to life, you know, and show people.
So I kind of go a little bit what you said earlier, Mike, and one of the biggest things about documentaries is the interviews. That's really one of the bread and butters of it. And so, like Mike, you talked about how with your one interview with the artist, how he revealed more information you didn't know. So as both of you as directors, we keep talking a little bit about it. Like Mary, you talked about how, you know, you try to tell the people beforehand what you're going to ask. And so how was both of your director styles with interviewing, of like letting them know, I'm going to tell you about everything we're going to talk about, or surprising them? I know you had to do that with one of the actresses, but for the other people, and just again, like Mike, you talked about, like sometimes they talk about stuff that's like, this is great, but not useful for me, doing that kind of free form. So how was that for both of you guys? And Mike, I'll let you start out with this.
Some people asked in advance what the questions would be. One was a family member, and he told me he didn't want to answer one question. So that was good to know, you know, rather than having him on camera saying, no, I don't want to discuss that. There was one wonderful actor, Anthony Zerbe, and I asked him the first question and he talked for 20 minutes. So, which was just incredible. And I was very drawn into him telling these incredible stories, some of which I didn't know. But it was, again, you're listening because I'm thinking, oh yeah, he's answering like the next three questions that I had. I think that for people who aren't used to being on camera, for example, family members or some people that worked with Jonathan and myself, back in the days of this production company I had with him, Clunes Associates, which Will McKinley was a part of, and maybe he'll speak about that in a minute. But for people who aren't being used to being on camera, I had what I would refer to as warm-up questions. They weren't the significant questions that I really wanted. I said, I'm sorry, my dog has just come into the room and wants attention. It's really to make them feel a little comfortable because they're very nervous on camera. And so I'm just trying to relax them, something that might be a little humorous. And then when I'm 10, 15 minutes in, now I'm going to get into the substantive questions. So that was something that I kind of picked up on that right away. I could see someone's nervous. And so I just sort of went off script and just, well, let's just chit chat and tell some stories. Now, if they brought something up that I hadn't thought about, I then maybe later on went back to it. So that, again, you really have to listen, because maybe you really need them to say the name of the theater where Jonathan performed. And you're realizing they didn't say that in their sentence. So you want to go back. Again, depends on the individual. You could literally stop them there. But again, with someone who's nervous anyway, maybe it's better to say, all right, that's great. I really love that story you told. Just want to go back and retell it, but be sure to mention the name of the theater or use the person's full name. And again, then they've got now a second opportunity to gather themselves. So again, it's sort of in the moment with the person. The actors were easier in the sense of because they were great storytellers. So it was, as I said, I was often drawn into the stories they were telling. So it really does depend on the person. I think that's very, very, very much key in terms of the interviews. And as was mentioned, another actor, David Selby, who had worked with Jonathan on Dark Shadows, and he's done a number of other both theater and television shows in his career. He is an incredible storyteller. My interview with him was an hour and a half. I didn't use all that material. It was just tremendous. And oftentimes, because he would start to recall himself some amazing memory, and he went off on a track, and I thought, well, that I don't need that, but let's keep going anyway, because then maybe something triggered and they came back to where I needed him to be. So again, it's really, it's an adventure, as I said earlier, because you don't necessarily know where those interviews are going to take you with certain people.
And Mike?
Yeah, actually, my interview style with everybody was completely informal. It was there were no questions that I had, that I sent them beforehand. With artists, for me, it was like, okay, let's start from the beginning. How did you get into art, doing comic book art, and working up into the pre-code era. Now, all of the artists would definitely, at least half of the interview, probably more, consisted of them going into the 60s and 70s, way beyond the pre-code. And it's very interesting stuff. I just had to keep kind of wrangling them back to into the 50s, the late 40s, early 50s, and say, okay, but remember when you were working for Ziff Davis, because they would get on to like Marvel comics and stuff in the 60s. And that's great. It's great stuff. And, they're telling their story. So I'm not at no point was I saying, okay, well, that's, not what I'm looking for or whatever. I would just try to guide them back. That was the thing. I would just bring them back and if they mentioned something, I'd be like, oh yes, well, with Avon Books, you were doing, this comic book in 1952, and then get them on the train again. And I did that as much as I possibly could. I think that in terms of, especially Everett Raymond Kinsler, his whole, this guy was drawing comics during World War II. I mean, when he was like 20, and he was actually in World War II. So he had this whole double thing where he explained how he was able to do stuff, illustrations and comic stuff, send it to the publishers while he was in the service. So when he got back, he was actually established. And that's when he really started getting heavily into doing illustrations and for Avon and doing the comic books. So that stuff is totally fascinating and a great lead up to the horror and science fiction comics he did in the 50s. Beyond that, it's really cool to hear about doing the portraits and getting into the non-comic book stuff. But, once again, I would, when that started happening, I would just lead back to, stuff that he was doing in the early 50s. And then we'd start talking about a particular title or publisher that he worked with, and it worked out great. He was the most lucid of the three artists that I interviewed, and he was still working at 94. He was in his smock, paint all over him. He had just finished up doing a portrait of a wealthy New York banker. That's what he was telling me. He had like Thomas Wolfe on his wall, portrait of him, various presidents around, it was absolutely amazing. And he loved it. It wasn't a thing where he downplayed the comic books. As a matter of fact, he loved working for them. It's just that he wanted to get into the portrait aspect of art. So it was for him, the comic books lasted until about 1954. And he just, went on doing the covers for Avon Books and then getting into portraits. So it was kind of a limited window. He literally did pre-code horror comics for about 4 years. But in that 4 years, he did some of the greatest stuff in the entire gamut of those pre-code comics, you know. So it was just amazing, and it was shocking to hear less than a year later that he had passed on, because he was totally in it. I mean, this guy was just, you know, I left, he went back to work, you know, 94 years old. It was just a stunning thing. His life was amazing, and you know, once again, I could just do a documentary on that guy alone. But that was my approach with everybody. I would go in, and first we'd talk for, you know, a while, like maybe a half an hour. We'd just talk about various things, and then we'd like settle down into the filming mode. And my first thing would be like, okay, well, you know, can you, you know, tell me how you got into art, doing art, illustrations, comic books. And then, so they just, you know, easiest thing to do is like start from the beginning. How did you get into it? How does that lead into the pre-code comic book era? You know, and it was great. With Vincent Zerzolo at Metropolis Collectibles, his were primarily just great stories about artists, particular stories and artists that he liked, and pieces of art that he had collected through the years, just like an incredibly rare, you know, original art that he had. And it was just, you know, it's for me, being a fan, all of this stuff was just like, you know, I'm a fanboy going into all this, just talking to like some of the greatest artists, you know, Joe Sinnott, who people may know. As a matter of fact, they would know him because he was the inker for Jack Kirby for years and years in Marvel Comics, the Fantastic Four, all of those original comics in the 60s. He was the inker for Jack Kirby. So that's what he's primarily known for. But what people don't know is that he was an artist on his own doing pre-code science fiction and horror art in the early 50s, you know, and Jack Kirby was too, for an entirely different company. People don't know that. So once again, that was the idea with the film, is spotlighting those things and saying, look, these people were doing other things too. They're famous for this, but they did this, you know, as well. And so it's just, as much as I could pack into 25 minutes, that's what I did. You know, it was the idea of introducing people to perhaps another world of that era, the pre-code comic book era that they were not aware of, you know. And I'm just really glad that I was able to interview 3 of the living artists, and it turned out better than I expected it
to be. Phil, I was going to mention that Will McKinley has done a number of interviews with people, but not for a documentary. But Will might have a thought to add to this conversation.
Go ahead, Will.
Oops.
I think you may have to be unmuted.
Oh, yeah.
Let's see. I'm asking you to unmute. There you go.
Great. Yes. And I wanted to point out that, Mike, you were mentioning that, you know, your being a fanboy was sort of vital to your approach on the interviews. This is one of the things that made Mary, I think, the absolute best person on the planet to direct this documentary, because she came at the Jonathan Frid story from multiple angles in a way that nobody else could have. She was a fan as a child, which a lot of us were. For me, it was in the reruns, but she was also a colleague and friend of the subject, Jonathan Frid. And third, which is a key point, she is a theater professional. You know, studied theater in college, began her career in New York in the theater, and when she met Jonathan, she was still, actively working in the theater. And that's what, sort of brought her to him with the suggestion that, that we should get him back in front of audiences. So she was able to bring those like three different perspectives to this documentary, which makes it a very rich thing. I think somebody else would have been like, oh yeah, let's talk about his famous thing, Dark Shadows, for most of it. And then we'll mention a little bit of his life before and a little bit of his life after. Mary took the risk, and it was a risk, to tell the complete story of his life. And I think that's one of the things that people are really reacting to. I've seen a number of reviews that mention that you don't need to be a Dark Shadows fan to enjoy this film, and that's key. I mean, in the same way, Mike, like you talking about pre-code comics, I mean, like as a filmmaker, I have an awareness of pre-code film, but I never thought of the idea of before the Comics Code Authority being, I didn't know that was considered pre-code. So, so that's interesting to me, even though I'm not super focused on your individual topic. That's what we're hearing with Mary's documentary. It's interesting to people who are, theater professionals. It's interesting to people who are Canadians. It's interesting to people who are just general television fans. So I think that's really key to the appeal of the film, and a credit to my old friend and colleague Mary for being the only person on the planet who could do that.
Thank you, Will.
Just mail me the check, please, after this Zoom.
Well, awesome. We're going to wrap up with one last question. So, Mary, you talked about, again, being a producer before this, and Mike, you talked about working on fiction horror before this. So both projects are kind of newish, doing documentaries. So what was both of your hurdles deciding to do a documentary that, again, was kind of something new you had to learn jumping into these projects you did?
Well, I would say the difficult part is the budget. So there was an executive on the project who was in charge of the budget, and I would ask him if I could go to Memphis to interview one person. He said, no, there's no money for that. But I wouldn't put up with that. So I used my own dime to get there. So that's, I think, for any filmmaker, it is about fundraising, getting the money. You can have the most incredible passion for it, but you have to sell somebody else on the idea to give you the money. So that's what I think every filmmaker you have to face, but it's a hurdle that can be overcome.
Yeah, an interesting thing about that, as I mentioned, I had finished Witch Tales, and I put that into film festivals. I was still living in Peru, so it made it into several film festivals, and a couple of film festivals were very close together. So I decided to fly over. And when I was over here, and this was during mid to end of 2019 when I did the interviews, I decided at that point, I was like, hey, I'm here. I'm gonna, go and interview these people, because it was kind of in a line. One artist was in South Carolina. The two other artists were in New York. One was in Albany, New York, and one was in New York City. So, and Vincent from Metropolis, of course, in New York City too. So it was kind of, I was on the East Coast. I just rented a car and literally drove up, stopped, interview, go to the next one. And this took like, I don't know, a week and a half to get all these interviews. And I mean, the budget for mine, now granted, it's a 25-minute film. I had an $1,800 budget. That was it. And I wasn't, it was, meant to be, originally, it was going to go onto the Blu-ray. of Witch Tales as a companion piece. I ended up shooting, and this is just, I have to add this because it kind of complicated things. When I was in Peru, when I cast for Witch Tales, I cast an entirely bilingual cast, Spanish and English speaking actors. Because what we did on set is we did two versions of the film. We would shoot a scene in Spanish, flip around and shoot it in English. So I have two versions of Witch Tales, both in Spanish and English. It is the first horror anthology film ever shot in two languages. And so what happened was that when I did the Blu-ray, I was like, God, if I could, get some kind of documentary on the pre-code comics into the Blu-ray, that would be great. Unfortunately, it ended up taking so much time to edit both of those versions of the film and just get those on a Blu-ray that I suddenly was like, oh my God, I've got to get this Blu-ray out. I haven't even edited any of the documentary yet. I had to release the Blu-ray, so I released the Blu-ray and then proceeded I don't know, it was about a 5 or 6 month process of finishing some minor video on the documentary and then editing it. So it was 6 months later before the documentary was even ready, and then with the documentary, I was like, okay, I'm going to just release it for free as a companion piece, for those that have seen Witch Tales or not. But, more so for all the people that bought the film so they could see, appreciate a little more of what I was, getting at with using those stories in the film, why I chose pre-code horror stories for the anthology. So that's kind of how it happened. It was just, I came over for Witch Tales in a few film festivals. During that time, I just took a car, drove up, interviewed these people, and that was kind of the bulk of Haunted Thrills. The rest of it was me compiling a lot of photos that I took of my own comic books, photos I got online, from other collectors and so forth, original art, and just putting it all together. And, because I really had it wasn't like, okay, here's A to Z how Haunted Thrills is going to be. It never was like that. I knew that I had to interview people. I had to actually get some of the artists to tell their story. I knew I had to at least get one great collector that could, kind of encapsulate a lot of things about pre-code horror comics as an authority on pre-code horror comics, and that was Vincent Zerzolo. And then trust myself as being a horror comics enthusiast, and knowing a lot about the history and, some of the there were things, it was as cutthroat as any other business. It really was. I mean, some of the things that EC did prior to them actually launching were questionable. And I've got that. That is part of the documentary too. And so, getting all of this out in the open, I think was an important thing, just like kind of making a more accurate history of how pre-code comics started, especially with science fiction and horror, and to a lesser degree, Westerns and romance. They were still in that pre-code era, but they weren't taking as many chances. Certainly Westerns, there were some graphic things that they allowed that were definitely banned after the Comics Code Authority came in. But it was just for me like a process of getting all of the stuff that I knew I needed and then mapping it out editing wise. I don't know how you guys did, thought about if you had it scripted totally.
No, not at all.
Right. Okay, there you go. I think that's how the best documentaries happen. Because once you get your interviews and you get footage and you go around, you talk to people, then it starts coalescing.
Yes.
Before, it's just like, well, I want to do this, but I don't know what's going to happen when I do it. What the things I'm going to find out, those interesting things I want to highlight, maybe some things I was thinking about that didn't work, that weren't as interesting, and so I'm going to leave that out. And for me, once again, it's a short documentary, it's 25 minutes. So my thing was putting as much as I could into it, and so even I've gotten comments like from people saying, well, yes, you did mention Steve Ditko, the artist, and his pre-code stuff before he started working for Marvel, because Steve Ditko is famous for Spider-Man. He was the original Spider-Man artist, but he did pre-code horror comics 10 years before that, and people just don't know. And so I got comments like, well, yeah, but you didn't put enough Steve Ditko in there. I'm like, okay, well, it's a 25-minute film, so, he only gets a minute. I'm sorry. That's just the way it goes. But my thing was, with most of the other artists that, of course, I have like dozens of artists, besides the people being interviewed, I had to think, yeah, well, they're going to be on there for maybe 30 seconds or a minute. I'm going to be like, okay, well, this guy also did this and this before he did this. And here's some examples of his work, and the time, like when he did it, publishers and so forth. And that's it. Move on to the next artist, or the next subject. It was definitely, the idea for me was to shine a light on artists and publishers that have been largely neglected, for that period. Because everybody remembers, as I say, it's EC Comics, Tales from the Crypt. Everybody knows that, but they don't know about the lesser publishers and artists of the era, So that was kind of the idea.
Gotcha. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap it here. Thank you for joining us, Will, Mike, and Mary. And for everyone who's watching this, please watch the other panel interviews, and the awards are tonight too, so feel free to watch that. And thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
See you guys.
Bye.
And everyone enjoy the rest of the festivals that's going on today. And well, if you haven't seen everything, I love both of your documentaries. So
thank you.
I very, very much enjoyed it.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.